Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy that you guys decided to come. I'm very sorry, but in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, all of our classes are conducted in English. Okay, so I want to give you guys a sample of a class. And so I'm going to give you guys a sample of a class, and it has to be in English. Okay, so you have to listen to English for about 45 minutes. Okay, so everybody do your best. I apologize to some of the parents in the room if maybe you haven't been studying English recently. It's okay. I have a lot of stuff you can look at, and even a little bit of Japanese. Okay, so すみませんでも全文英語でやってます今からね。All right, so now we're only speaking English. Okay, my name is Eddie Hearn. I'm an associate professor in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Okay, and I'm a political scientist, and so I study international relations. Okay, so I have a PhD in political science from Florida State University in the United States, and I teach classes here about foreign policy and about global relations and about international relations. Okay, now don't get upset if you're interested in global studies but you're not interested in international relations. That's fine. Okay, this is just one example of the types of classes in the Department of Global Studies. Okay, we also have global communication. We also have global cultural studies. Okay, but I'm going to teach you a little bit about a really basic introduction to international relations. Okay, and the classes that I teach are almost identical to the classes that I taught at universities in the United States. Okay, so if you can understand this class or this introduction, you can go study in the United States, or you can go study in England, or you can go study in Australia. But we want to give the same quality education in English to students right here in Japan. Okay, so we're going to have a little introduction to Prospectus on International Relations, Missiles, Trade Wars, and Pollution. Okay, and so that's what we're going to talk about. Now, I want to bring up a picture here about international relations. And in this picture, we have a lot of different things. We have, these are actually US Marines who have entered into Saddam's palace in Baghdad, right? We have a picture of a boat to represent international trade. We have a picture of a coking plant. That's where you burn coal to make power, to make energy, polluting the atmosphere, right? And so when we think about international relations thinks about topics including all of these things. And these things are very different, right? So you might ask yourself, what does war have to do with pollution, have to do with trade, right? How could we study all of these things from a framework? And that's what I want to talk to you guys today about. A framework for understanding international relations regardless of the topic that you're interested in. So if you're interested in conflict and security and missiles and bombs and all of those types of things, or if you're interested in trade and finance and investment and multinational companies, or if you're interested in pollution and saving the environment or things like human rights, we can study all of these things from a unified framework. Okay? Now, what is that framework? So the problem that we have to ask ourselves, the problem that we're concerned with is how can we serve the collective good in international relations? And so what I mean by the collective good is to create a good or create an outcome that is beneficial to everyone, okay? And so if we're talking about war, the collective good is peace. So how can we create peace? If we're talking about the international economy, the collective good is an open and free economy. How can we create an open and free economy? If we're talking about global warming, the collective good is stopping global warming, caring more about the environment. So how can we create an international society that will serve the collective good? And that's what I want you guys to think about, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, okay? And so the idea here is although these are all very different topics, they're all taking place in the international environment. And so what that means is that every country has to care what other countries do. Okay, and so that's what we call a strategic interaction. And so the question that we ask ourselves is, how can we make policies or make outcomes that serve the collective good, like peace, like freedom, like a healthy and clean environment? How can we do this in an international system that is anarchy? Okay? And what we mean by anarchy is we don't mean chaos. we mean that there's an absence of a centralized political authority. And so what we're talking about here is how can we get to better outcomes in an environment in which there is no centralized authority. And that's the essence of international relations, okay? And so what we have to ask ourselves, or what most of international relations is trying to understand, is what is the effect of anarchy? What is the effect of anarchy in the international system on things like peace, on things like trade, on things like the environment? And so that's what we want to understand, and that's what we want to think about today, okay? Because the effect of anarchy doesn't mean chaos. It doesn't mean that we can't understand. But what we want to understand is how does anarchy, or how does the environment influence states or influence the actors in the situation, okay? Now, this might sound a little confusing, right? You guys are like, oh no, this might be a little bit confusing so far. But it's really, really easy. And I'm going to give you guys a really, really simple example, and then you'll understand, okay? And we're going to play a very, very simple game, okay? Now, I'm going to teach you guys the easiest game. This is game theory, okay? And game theory is a tool for analyzing strategic interaction, okay? And what strategic interaction is when your actions are influenced by the actions of others. So when a state makes a decision, they don't make a decision in a vacuum. The decisions of other states also influence that decision, okay? And so that's called a strategic interaction, okay? So I'm going to teach you guys a really, really simple game, a game that you've probably heard of, and possibly a game that you've seen on movies or in TV shows or something like that, okay? And so I'm going to teach you a game called the Prisoner's Dilemma. Now, why we're going to learn the Prisoner's Dilemma is the Prisoner's Dilemma can help you understand the effect of anarchy on making a decision, okay? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn a really simple game, the Prisoner's Dilemma, and then if we have time, we'll see if we can apply that to a simple example from international relations, okay? So let's play a game. The game is called the Prisoner's Dilemma, okay? Now, in the Prisoner's Dilemma, we have two actors, prisoner A and prisoner B, okay? Now, the game starts out very, very simply, okay? The prisoners rob a bank, okay? So imagine you rob a bank. And so two prisoners rob a bank, and after they rob the bank, the police find them and they arrest them. And that is the setup to the Prisoner's Dilemma, okay? Two prisoners have robbed the bank, and the police have caught them. Now, the police want to find out what is going on, okay? So this is the game, right? In the Prisoner's Dilemma, the prisoners cannot speak to one another, right? So the first thing that the police do after they arrest you, they take one prisoner over here, and they take the other prisoner over here, okay? And what the prisoners are doing is they're going to be interrogated or questioned by the police. And so the police want to get the prisoners to confess to robbing the bank, okay? But here's the problem. The police cannot prove that the prisoners robbed the bank. The police really believe the prisoners robbed the bank, but they don't have evidence, they don't have proof. All they have is that they found the prisoners with a gun, okay? And so the prisoners have an illegal gun, but they have no proof that they robbed the bank. And so the police say, okay, what we need to do is we need to separate these prisoners and we need to interrogate them, okay? And this is the game, right? Okay, the prisoners can be charged with gun possession, right? And if you're charged with gun possession, the police caught them with a gun. If you're charged with gun possession, you get 1 year sentence in prison, okay? But the police want to charge the prisoners with armed robbery, right? And if you get charged with armed robbery, you get 10 years in prison, okay? So you get 1 year in prison because you got caught with a gun, right? But you could get 10 years in prison if you're convicted of armed robbery. But the problem is the cops can't prove that you committed armed robbery, okay? And so unless one of the prisoners confesses, you'll only be charged with the gun charge, okay? And so that's the setup of the game, right? Now, if you cooperate and you tell the police the truth, the police will give you what's called a reduced sentence, okay? And a reduced sentence means for cooperating, you're charged with armed robbery, but you don't get 10 years of prison, you only get 5 years of prison, okay? But here's the real key to the game, right? The police will also accept what's called a plea bargain, okay? And a plea bargain means, okay, if you rat on your friend if you tell us that your friend did it and you tell us what happened, you can testify against your partner and you can have no prison time. Okay, so this is the setup of the game. Okay, so this is a very, very simple game and the first game theory game that you can play and learn. Okay, so let me show you guys the game. Okay, so in the game, you have two players. Okay, you have prisoner A and prisoner B. All right, now prisoner A, he's been arrested, he's been separated, right? So prisoner A can do one of two things. He can confess and he can admit to robbing the bank and tell them what his partner did, or he can stay quiet, okay? He can not say anything, okay? He can cooperate with his partner, okay? So he can confess or stay quiet. Now, if we look at prisoner 2, prisoner B has the same options, right? Prisoner B can confess, right? And he can tell the police that they robbed the bank and he can testify against his partner. Or prisoner B can stay quiet, okay? And he can cooperate with his partner and not say anything, okay? So this is the game, right? And each square in the game represents, oh, that's a weird button. Each square in the game represents an outcome. So this would represent what happens if both players confess, right? Or if both players are quiet, the outcome would be in the bottom square, okay? So we can see what the outcome for each decision would be. Okay, so we have 4 outcomes. If both players confess, they'll be charged with armed robbery. Right? So if both players confess, they're charged with armed robbery, they get a reduced sentence, they don't get a plea bargain. Because you can't get a plea bargain because they no longer need your plea, right? They don't need your testimony, right? And so if both players confess, we're going to end up in an armed robbery reduced sentence, okay? If both players are quiet and cooperate, right? If both players are quiet and cooperate, we'll end up down here in the bottom corner and you'll be charged with gun possession, right? So just a gun possession charge. Now, the interesting thing happens if one player confesses and the other stays quiet, okay? So if player A stays quiet, but player B confesses, right? Player A, right, will get charged with armed robbery, and player B will testify against him, okay? And the opposite would occur if player B stays quiet and player A confesses. If player B stays quiet, player B will be charged with armed robbery, and player A will get to accept the plea bargain, okay? So this is the setup of the game, right? And we can see what would happen in each situation, right? So if we get confess, right? If both people confess, we're both going to get 5 years in prison, right? We both go to prison for armed robbery, we get the reduced sentence, okay? So both people confessing leads to both people getting 5 years in prison. Now, if player A stays quiet, he cooperates with his partner in crime and stays quiet, but player B confesses, right? Then player A gets charged with armed robbery, which is 10 years in prison. So player A gets 10 years in prison, player B gets 0 years in prison, okay? And if we move to the next square, if player B is quiet and player A confesses, right? Well, player B gets armed robbery charge, he keeps quiet and he goes to jail for armed robbery, 10 years, right? Player A gets the plea bargain and he gets 0 years in prison. Okay, now that leads us to the last example. The last possibility is, what if both prisoners stayed quiet? Okay, well, if both prisoners stayed quiet, right, the police cannot charge you with armed robbery. All the police can do is charge you for gun possession. And gun possession comes with a 1-year prison sentence, right? So both people will spend 1 year in prison. Okay, so this is the setup of our game. These are our choices. These are the outcomes of our choices. What you have to do is you have to ask yourself, would you confess or would you stay quiet? What would be the rational solution to your problem? Okay, so luckily, this is a very, very easy game to solve. So we can find the equilibrium of the game and solve it. But first, what we need to do is order our preferences. Okay, so let's think about our preferences. So imagine you're a prisoner A. Okay, so if you're a prisoner A, what would your preferred outcomes be? Okay, how would you prefer the game to end if you're prisoner A? That's what we want to think about first. Okay, now what we're going to adopt here is a rational model. And so in a rational model, we're going to say that I prefer less prison to more prison, right? And so I would prefer no prison to prison, and I would prefer fewer years in prison to more years in prison, right? Now, I can make rational models using things like income. I would prefer more income to less income, right? Jail time would be opposite. But here we're going to make the assumption, right? The rational assumption that I prefer less prison to more prison, right? And so I would prefer to not go to prison, okay? Now, if we look at this, if we think about it, if we were player A, I would prefer the best option be no prison, okay? I would prefer to not go to prison. The only way for me to not go to prison is I confess and my partner stays quiet, right? So I confess and my partner stays quiet is what I want to happen, okay? That's the best outcome for me. So I'm going to give that outcome a 4, okay? And in our payouts, I put a blue 4 in the box. The left side of the box, the blue in the box represents player A. The right side of the column is going to represent player B, the red, okay? And so I'm going to put a 4 here. That's his payoff for not going to prison, okay? And so dealing with payoffs, higher numbers are better than lower numbers, okay? So my first option, my best option as prisoner A is I confess and prisoner B stays quiet. And I'm going to give that a 4, okay? Now, I can see what my second best option would be, but my second best option would be I only serve 1 year in prison, okay? And so how do I only serve 1 year in prison? Well, we both stay quiet, okay? If we just both stay quiet, we just go to prison for 1 year, that's my second best outcome, so I'm going to give that a payoff of 3, okay? And so I put the 3 in the box where player 1 or player A, right, will get 1 year in prison, quiet, okay? Now, my third best option. My third best option is 5 years in prison. That reduced sentence, okay? So 5 years in prison is the next option. I'm going to give that a number 3, right? How do I get 5 years in prison? Well, I get 5 years in prison if we both confess, okay? Now, this leads us to our worst option. Now, our worst option is what we call the sucker's payout, okay? And so what you don't ever want to get is you don't want to get the sucker's payout. The sucker's payout means you spend 10 years in prison and you're the sucker, right? And why do you spend 10 years in prison? You cooperated, you did the right thing, you kept your mouth shut, and your partner told on you to the police, right? And then your partner goes home free and you go to prison for 10 years, okay? So that's the worst outcome. So I'm going to give that a 1, right? So now we have a game with payouts for prisoner A. The next thing that we need to solve the game is we need payouts for prisoner B, okay? So we have to ask ourselves the same question. What would prisoner B prefer? Okay, and so what are the preferred outcomes for prisoner B? Well, the preferred outcomes for prisoner B are exactly the same as the preferred outcomes for prisoner A, but in reverse, right? So prisoner B prefers no prison, right? How does prisoner B get no prison? Well, prisoner B gets no prison, right, if he confesses and prisoner A stays quiet, right? So I'm going to put a 4 there for no prison for prisoner B, okay? Now, second best option would be 1 year in prison, just as before, right? And I'm going to put a 3 for 1 year in prison for the payout. And 1 year in prison is if we're both quiet, if we both keep our mouths shut, and we'll get 1 year in prison, then we can go free, okay? Now, third best option. Third best option is we both confess, right? The same as before, so I'm going to put a 2 in confess, right? So we have a 2 in confess, and our worst outcome is that sucker's payout again, right? That 10 years in prison when you stay quiet, you cooperate, but your partner refuses to cooperate, right? And I'm going to put the 1 there for prisoner B, right? And so now we have a game, we have actions, we have payouts, and we can solve this game. Okay? How do you solve this game? Well, you find what's called the Nash Equilibrium. And that sounds complicated, but the Nash Equilibrium is a really simple concept. The Nash Equilibrium simply means that no player has an incentive to change their mind regardless of what another player does. Okay? And this game is really simple to find a Nash Equilibrium, but we'll go through it step by step and see if we can find it. Okay? So let's see if we can solve the game. And what solving the game means is, what is the likely or expected outcome of the game? What do you think is going to happen? Are the prisoners going to talk, or are the prisoners going to stay quiet? Right? That's what we want to understand. What's going to happen? What do we expect to happen? Okay? So ask yourself, right? If you were prisoner B, imagine I'm prisoner B. I've been separated from prisoner A. I can't talk to prisoner A. He's been separated away from me. And I have to ask myself, okay, what is prisoner A doing? Let's assume prisoner A confesses. Okay? If prisoner A confesses, what should prisoner B do? If prisoner A confesses, prisoner B has a decision to make. Right? He can confess and get a 2, or he can stay quiet and get the sucker's payout. Right? So he can confess and get a 2, or he can stay quiet and get a 1. Well, remember, 2 is better than 1, right? So what would a rational actor do? Well, a rational actor, right, would confess, right? And so if prisoner A confesses, prisoner B should also confess, because 2 is better than 1, right? 5 years in prison is better than 10 years in prison, okay? So if prisoner A confesses, prisoner B also confesses, right? Now, what would happen, though, if prisoner A is quiet? Well, if prisoner A is quiet, prisoner B has a decision, right? I can confess and get 4, or I can stay quiet and get 3, right? But remember, 4 is better than 3, right? No prison is better than going to prison, right? And if player A confesses, or player A stays quiet, if player A stays quiet, right, player B, right, should confess, right? And so what we see here is that it's really easy to find the equilibrium to this game, because no matter what, you should confess, right? And so player A faces the exact same outcomes, the exact same equilibrium, right? And the expected outcome of this game is that both prisoners confess, right? And so we catch the criminals, we separate them, we interrogate them, they both confess, they go to jail on the plea bargain for 5 years, right? But there's something very, very interesting here, okay? And the interesting thing here, and the thing that we were talking about at the beginning of class, is the collective good, right? Now, the equilibrium to this game is confess, confess. But confess, confess does not serve the collective good of the prisoners, right? And we could see that both prisoners would prefer to be down here in quiet, quiet, right? Because quiet, quiet is 3-3. And 3-3 is better than 2-2, right? And so the interesting thing of the game is the outcome of this game is non-cooperation. The outcome of this game is ratting out your partner, right? If we're talking about international relations, the outcome is non-cooperation. But both players, both actors would be better off if they cooperated, right? So what we want to understand is, how can we move from confess, confess to quiet, quiet? Or how can we move from non-cooperation, non-cooperation to cooperation, cooperation? Now, it's weird to think about prisoners being quiet as cooperation, but in our game, that's cooperation, right? So how can we move from that confess, confess to stay quiet, stay quiet? Now, think about it, right? Do all prisoners confess? No, right? Prisoners don't always confess. Maybe in Japan. I think Japan has like a 98% confession rate, but that might have something to do with some uniqueness of the legal system, right? Most of the time, we don't expect all criminals to confess. Why don't criminals confess? Okay, and so that's what I want to talk to you guys about. How can we move from that category down right? And when you learn that, you'll actually learn the major approaches to international relations. Okay? So how can we move to cooperation, right? How can we overcome the prisoner's dilemma? Well, the first way that we can overcome the prisoner's dilemma is power, okay? Simply power. Okay? Now, think about if you're a prisoner, right? Stronger prisoners can threaten weaker prisoners, right? But more so than that, gangs can threaten prisoners. And in fact, I say to you, if you confess, I'm going to kill you. Right? That changes your rationality of the game, right? Because I've applied outside enforcement. So if you confess, your gang will kill you whether you're in prison or not in prison, right? So now power is preventing you from taking the selfless act of confession, right? Now, in international relations, we can see the same thing, that power is a solution to the cooperation problem, right? Is there a third party that's powerful enough to enforce cooperation, right? Now, for much of the 20th century, some people thought that the United States could be that country, right? That would be powerful enough to force other countries to cooperate. Now, that's not a nice world to live in. It's not a fair world to live in. It's a world where a stronger, more powerful, thuggish country can create order in the system and create cooperation, right? And if we think about international relations, this is the theory of international relations that we call realism. And in realism, everything is about power. The world is about power, and security is about power. And we live in a world that's about self-help. No one will help you. You have to defend yourself. You have to be powerful. Powerful countries can create order within the system, right? So one way to get out of the prisoner's dilemma is through power, okay? Now, there's other ways that we can get out of the prisoner's dilemma. Another way that we can get out of the prisoner's dilemma is reciprocity, okay? Now, this is simply the idea, imagine you're a prisoner, you're a criminal, right? If you confess, right? And if you rat out your partner and you say, okay, I did it, I'm going to plea bargain against him, right? In the future, no other prisoners, no other criminals will ever work with you again, right? And let's assume it's really hard to rob a bank by yourself. And if you care about your long-term interest, right, you want to cooperate, you want to give up the short-term gains in order to have long-term gains over the future, right? And this is what we call reciprocity. So if you stay quiet, I'll stay quiet, and over the long run, we'll be better off, right? Now, if we think about international relations theory, this is the theory of liberalism. Okay, we can create international rules. We can create an international structure based on reciprocity. If you follow the rules, I'll follow the rules. And if everybody follows the rules, we'll all be better off, right? And so you can think about something like the World Trade Organization. Okay, I'll create rules about world trade. You don't put tariffs on your products. I don't put tariffs on my products. Our economies all benefit, and everyone is better off, right? And so this is the idea of reciprocity. This is also the idea of creating international institutions like the United Nations or other types of international institutions that can create order without using force. Okay, they can create order through reciprocity. You're better off being part of the international system than being a pariah or being outside the international system, right? So we might see that a little bit if you look at, say, Russia. Okay, is Russia better off to participate in the international system, or are they being harmed by being a pariah, being kicked out of the international system, right? And so reciprocity, if you do the right thing, if you follow the law, I'll follow the law, and we can create order, we can create rules, we can create institutions without relying on simply force, okay? So that's the second way we could overcome the prisoner's dilemma. There's one other way that we could overcome the prisoner's dilemma, but it's a little bit complicated, okay? And another way we could overcome the prisoner's dilemma is we could change our norms and our values, okay? And so one way to think about this is the power of ideas, okay? So imagine if you were a prisoner and your identity as a criminal was so strong, so powerful, that you cared more about that than speaking to the police, right? And so you say, I'm not going to talk to the police. I'm a criminal. We don't talk to the police. That's who we are, right? And so this is a situation where identity or norms or values can create order in the international system, okay? I always watch these shows. I was watching this show about a cartel, and they always arrest a cartel member, and he's always like, somos bandidos, no somos sapos, which is no somos sapos is like, we're not rats, right? We're really criminals, and we really believe in this, and I would never devalue myself and talk talk to the police, right? Now, in international relations, you could think about something like the environment, right? This is what we call constructivism in international relations. And constructivism says, well, anarchy in the international system is what we make it out to be, right? We create norms and values. We create norms and beliefs about slavery. Slavery is wrong, right? You can't choose that option anymore. Or, human rights or gender equality or the environment. How do we treat the environment? Do we really believe, right, that the environment is important? Okay, and so the argument here would be if you want to create cooperation, you don't create reciprocity, you don't use force, you change people's attitudes, you change people's norms, you change people's values. Now, that's a very, very hard thing to do, right? That's a very, very time-intensive thing to do, very, very difficult thing to do, but you could think about something like the environment, right? Why is global warming occurring? Well, maybe people really haven't adopted the values that say, hey, the environment is more important than the economy, right? And if they really had those values, then we could have cooperation in policy, right? And so this is the idea that everything in international relations is constructed, okay? So it's a little bit abstract, but we have three theories, right? We have realism, it's all about power, right? We can create order through power. We have liberalism, it's all about reciprocity. We can create order by making everyone better off, right? And we have constructivism, it's all about ideas and values. We can create order, we can create cooperation by changing people's values, changing people's beliefs, creating new attitudes, okay? Now, this makes sense dealing about a prisoner. I want to give you guys a little example from international relations to see if we can help think about it a little more. Okay? Now, there are a lot of examples we could have used, could have thought about. I have a brief example thinking about Japan, thinking about Japan's security situation, specifically dealing with the Korean Peninsula or North Korea. Right? And so one of the things that you guys are likely aware of, right, is that North Korea has a habit of launching missiles into Japanese space, very, very close to Japanese territory, into Japanese territory, right? Which causes a security concern in the region. Okay, so let's think a little bit about Japan and North Korea. Okay, so instead of having prisoner A and prisoner B, we can change our two players to Japan and North Korea. Okay, and instead of talking or staying quiet, okay, instead of confessing or quiet, we can change our actions to build or reframe. Okay, and so what we mean by build here is we mean build up missile capabilities. Okay, so you can build up missile capabilities, you can get missiles out, ready to launch them, right? Or you can refrain from doing that. Okay, so these are our two options, and these are our two players. Okay, now we can put this into our game, and we can see what would be the outcome depending upon the options that are selected, right? And so if both Japan and both North Korea decide to build up their weapons capabilities, this is what we call an arms race, okay? And we'd be in this top square. This is what we would call an arms race, or we would have escalation. Now, arms race is not a good thing, right? An arms race makes the possibility of conflict greater, the possibility of an accident greater, the possibility of accidentally using a weapon greater, right? It also creates a misallocation of funds, right? Particularly difficult for North Korea. They're spending money building missiles while their population is starving, right? But not a good thing for Japan with an aging population, right? To waste money or resources on missiles all of the time, right? And so escalation wouldn't necessarily be a good thing, right? If both people refrain, right? If both people refrain, that would be de-escalation or arms control, right? We would have no missiles. They wouldn't point missiles at Japan. Japan wouldn't retaliate, right? We would have de-escalation. Okay? Now, we also have the off corners. Okay, so imagine, right, maybe what we kind of see occurring, right? North Korea is building, and Japan to some extent is refraining, right? So if North Korea builds and Japan refrains, well, the problem here is, right, is Japan's threatened because there's missiles and they're coming into Japanese territory, and North Korea has a power increase, right? North Korea is more powerful than they would be, okay? Now, the other possibility would be, well, North Korea refrains up here in the top, North Korea refrains, and Japan builds. And if that was the case, then North Korea's security would be threatened, right? And Japan would have an increased power presence, right? So this is the setup of the game. Now, we could ask ourselves, what are our preferred outcomes? What would your preferred outcomes be if you're Japan? What would your preferred outcomes be if you're North Korea? Well, I'm going to skip ahead and put it in a little bit faster, right? But here, instead of jail time, right, from a rational framework, we consider a country's number one interest to be security, right? And so every country is concerned about security. So your number one interest is security, right? So your best outcome is that you increase your security. Well, how do you increase your security? You build and your partner refrains, right? And so if Japan builds and North Korea refrains, right, that's a good thing for Japan, right? If North Korea builds and Japan refrains, that's a good thing for North Korea, okay? Now, the second best thing for everyone would be de-escalation. You don't have missiles and I don't have missiles, right? We just de-escalate the situation. We quit spending time on missiles, right? We quit spending money on missiles, and we get to this refrain, de-escalation square, right? Now, the third thing, right? The second worst thing, right? That's going to get a number 2. The second worst thing is that we have an arms race. You build up missiles, I build up missiles, we waste money on missiles, we make the world more dangerous, right? We risk the possibility of a catastrophe, right? And so we're going to get a 2-2 for build, right? Now, the worst thing that can happen to you, though, is you become the sucker. And you become the sucker by letting your opponent build and you refrain, right? And so North Korea says, oh, we're not going to build any missiles, but they build missiles, and Japan refrains. And the next thing we know, right, North Korea is building, and they're getting more powerful, and Japan's refraining, and we're down here in the suckers category, right? Or North Korea could be the sucker, right? If Japan builds and North Korea refrains, and then Japan can then flaunt their power over North Korea, right? So here's our game, looking at the concept of an arms race, using the example of Japan and North Korea, okay? So now we might ask ourselves, well, what is going to be the solution to this game? Well, you guys probably already realize it, but this is the exact same game. This is the prisoner's dilemma, okay? And so the solution to the game is still the same solution, build, right? And so the solution to the prisoner's dilemma in the arms race is that the world will spiral into an arms race. And this game was often used to talk about the United States and the Soviet Union, right, during the Cold War, right, back before the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And so the question here is that Japan and North Korea can both get a 2 from escalation, right? They can both get a 2 from escalation, but they would both be better off, right, if they could refrain. Okay? And so what we have to ask ourselves is, how can we move Japan and North Korea from the possibility of build, from the possibility of an arms race, from the possibility of escalation, right? How can we move from that build category to that refrain category? Okay, and so that's the question that we're trying to answer, right? And we can answer that depending upon which theoretical perspective that we believe, right? And so if you believe that power is the only way to overcome the problem, right? Then if we wanted to get the refrain, we need a third powerful party, right? We need a country that has the capabilities to enforce their will on all countries in the world, right? Now, that could be the United States, it could be China, right? It could be whoever, right? But it would mean some outside force that is forcing cooperation, right? If you believe in liberalism, if you believe in reciprocity, you say, okay, we don't need that. What we need to do is we need to sit down with North Korea, we need to bargain, we need to come to an agreement. Right? We need to come to an agreement where both people are better off, right? But that's a very, very difficult thing to do, right? And bargaining also means, it doesn't mean you get to do exactly what you want. It means you have to give a little bit to North Korea, no matter what you think about it, right? It has to be something that both countries would prefer to building up, right? And so we could work on international bargaining, creating reciprocity, creating interaction, those types of things. Or the third way that we could approach this problem would be through the ideas of constructivism. Right? And that's a little bit harder to think about. But what that would mean is really trying to understand why Japan and North Korea view each other as a threat, right? And changing those attitudes that have been formed or created over the last 50 or 60 years, right? And so that would be a much, much more sociological approach to dealing with the problem, okay? So we could also think about things like the environment, global warming, right? If you want to stop climate change, right? Does that require a powerful country to force people to stop using fossil fuels? right? Does it mean that we have really complicated bargaining at the UN and different organizations and create reciprocal agreements that everyone benefits from that will lead to a change in our actions? Or does it mean that we need to change people's attitudes and their opinions about the environment, right? Change people's perception about what's more important, the environment or the economy. We could also think about things like trade, right? How do we encourage cooperation, okay? And so what I want you guys to think about is international relations is not just about topics, it's about understanding different topics from a shared theoretical framework, okay? And so I introduced you guys to the three main theoretical frameworks in international relations, which is realism, liberalism, and constructivism, okay? And you can use that framework to think about all of the sort of international events that you read about in the paper and to understand the idea of strategic interaction. Okay, and all strategic interaction is I can't just decide something. I have to decide something based on what I think someone else is going to decide, right? And so just like that prisoner, I might want to be quiet, but I have to think about what my partner is going to do. Just like Japan probably doesn't want to build up missiles, but they have to think, what is North Korea going to do, right? And thinking about the environment, maybe you do want to reduce carbon, but you also have to think, okay, but what is the United States going to do? What is China going to do, right? So the key about all of these situations is their strategic interactions. And these strategic interactions take place in anarchy, right? Because the international environment has no fixed moral authority, okay? So I hope you guys enjoyed a little introduction to international relations. Our 45 minutes is about up. If you're interested, I hope you go to Musashi or anywhere and take a class on international relations, but also just think about international relations and think about the prisoner's dilemma next time you read a story or even watch a movie. Lots of movies are actually based on the prisoner dilemma, if you like superheroes and those types of things, okay? All right, thank you guys very much.